We have a selection of very early cinema shot in 68 millimeter that will be introduced and narrated by our great friend and scholar, Paul Spehr, who we're delighted could be with us today. And I am going to try and run the technology a little bit and see how we want to proceed. But please welcome Paul.
You're going to move this.
Yeah.
I'm taking you to quite a different area than what we've been in. I started off in my life working at the Library of Congress. They hired me to play with a lot of the very early films that had been sent to the library on paper. This was done because they could copyright it that way. And it was the record going back to the very beginning of cinema. And I became quite fascinated with it, and I've retired from the library, and I don't play with paper prints anymore, although I fuss about them every once in a while. But I've become quite fascinated with the character of early cinema, and particularly with the Biograph Company, in part because there's been a great deal of attention to the other major film company of that era, the Edison Company. And much of the attention with the Biograph Company has been on their later productions. But I've been looking at the very early cinema, and I've found it quite fascinating and rather sorely misunderstood. And I'm very happy that I'm sharing this interest with quite a number of other places. Mark mentioned iCinema and British Film Institute, who have been very interested in restoring these very early Biograph films. And by sheer coincidence, I found out today that the British Film Institute is presenting a whole program of these Biograph films at their theater in London today. So you will get to see a branch of what people in London are seeing today. So.
Should we just go to the films, or did you?
Yeah. For many people, Biograph brings to mind D.W. Griffith, or the long protracted lawsuit between Biograph Company and Thomas Edison, which lasted for a decade. But something important was forgotten or overlooked. Between 1896 and 1900, the Biograph was the most popular movie experience in the world. Almost universally considered the best. Why? Biograph projector gave a very large image, 68 millimeter, almost 70 millimeter. It was the steadiest image in an age when people called the movies the flickers. They also produced a group of new films quite regularly that were well made and very much worthwhile watching. And you'll get to see some in a few minutes. Here's some background information on the company. It was incorporated as the American Mutoscope Company in December of 1895. Mutoscope was an advertising device originally, but it could also be looked to view entertainment. But you saw the images on cards, and you twisted a crank, and they changed. And the idea for advertising was that it would show something that was very hard to describe. And this appealed to investors, so it was a very well-financed company. There was almost $2 million worth of shares issued, and it was very well subscribed. The group that designed the mutoscope were a very interesting group. They called themselves the KMCD, and they were four friends who shared a strong interest in novelties. And they financed the company by assigning the patents that they had on a variety of machines. Elias P. Koopman was the K of the KMCD. He was a businessman. Herman Kassler was a young inventor and a machinist, and they gave him the credit for inventing the mutoscope camera and the projector. William Kennedy Laurie Dixon was an inventor who had worked for Thomas Edison and designed Edison's kinetoscope. And he devised the 35 millimeter format, which lasted for 120 years, built first movie studios. Harry Marvin was an inventor and a businessman, and he had invented a mining drill, which had devised a factory to build that. He also married the banker's daughter, which gave him very good business connections. And each of these people continued to work on new designs of new machines. But they had to change their plans almost immediately, because actually the day after their company was incorporated, the cinematograph was introduced by the Lumieres in Paris, and projection became the immediate new thing. And the biograph projector was very quickly designed. They'd actually had it on paper, but they rushed it through and were ready to introduce it later. They credited the design as being done by Herman Kassler, but he probably had strong advice from W.K.L. Dixon, who had actually designed Edison's machine. They knew Edison would sue. The projectors were made at this machine shop in Canastota, New York. It was the camera had been designed earlier. They initially had proposed that they would use Edison films and enlarge them and for better viewing than Edison's kinetoscope, which was also a peep show machine. But Edison said no, he wasn't interested in that. So they built a camera to make films for the mutoscope. And it used film for Kodak still cameras. The film had to be advanced by friction because that evaded Edison's design, which used sprockets and sprocket holes in the film to advance the film. The result was a large and very steady image. You can see here the comparisons of the image that they projected with the 35 millimeter that's on the bottom of the screen over there. The camera was designed with an adjustable speed. It could take up to 40 frames a second, but they rather quickly standardized to about 30 frames a second, which was about twice as fast as most of the competing machines. The result was a steadier and more consistent image on the screen. The projectors were premiered on October 12th, 1896 at Hammerstein's Theater in New York. And what they saw was the candidate for president, William McKinley, and the Empire State Express, which was the high-speed train. It ran at the world's record speed of 60 miles an hour along the New York Central Railroad.
And that will be one of our films.
Yes, you will see it.
Is this a good time to transition to the film?
Yes, probably.
That'd be okay? Great. Okay. So thank you very much, Paul, and we will also count on you to narrate our film program, which is right here. So again, thanks to the iFilm Museum for making these materials available to us. And we've inserted titles. There's no sound, so we're actually disobeying one of the cardinal rules of cinema, where there was always accompaniment. So we will have some narration in lieu of a piano player.
You're about to see a phantom train ride. You will be on the front of a train passing through the Riviera.
Is there a way to dim the lights, Mark?
Can we dim the lights?
We'll take care of it. Thank you.
This is actually a much longer piece of film than most of what audiences saw. The standard running time for most of the Biograph films was less than 1 minute, sometimes 30 or 40 seconds.
And we see the evidence of the friction
Yes.
in this print. So the pinch rollers is what leads to those white spaces toward the bottom, because there were no sprockets. It was a pinch roller system. So some of the early films, you see the wear and tear on the print that evolved. Very
Not
imaginative.
quite sure why these have this on this, whether they were rejected at some point because of defects.
Yeah. But I'm always fascinated by this use of the Z-axis in these phantom rides and the engagement with the spectacle of moving images. These films are so emblematic of a certain kind of moment in modernity in which cinema is not only documenting modernity, but also is part and parcel of modernity. And there's kind of a fluidity between the spectacle of cinema and the spectacle of the new city and the experiences of the new city and the enthrall with these new perspectives that were being provided for people.
When they started doing these phantom rides, they were quite a sensation because they gave audiences a different feel for what the moving image was. They felt they were taking the ride, and the responses were quite remarkable with them. And there were enough of these made that for a while, about 1907 or 8, there was a concession called Hale's Tours, where you could sit on a railroad car and they would project them at the end of the car. This film was probably made by W.K.L. Dixon. He had gone down to the Riviera to film Admiral Dewey, who was coming back from the Philippines after defeating the Spanish Navy in the Philippines.
And one of the interesting facets of the Biograph company was how it inspired companies' offsprings in different European capitals.
Yes. I haven't seen Wonderful Mutoscopes.
Oh, well, here we go.
Yes, this is a little comedy. It's British comedy.
And it demonstrates the peep show quality of the device,
Yes.
that it was available as, again, part of this new urban experience, part of modernity. And this little boy is sucking the cigarette and creates an episode.
Now we will take you back to the beginning. This is one of the first shots that the company made for public showing in 1896. This is a corner that is right near where their office and studio was on Broadway and 14th Street in New York City. And this shows the city traffic at the time. And this is view on the boulevard. This was a bicycle exposition. The boulevard was an area very close to where the Yankee Stadium was in Upper Harlem. And this is at the time that the bicycle craze was very heavy. The boulevard was also an area where people would go for carriage rides. Now is Empire State Express.
And this was a sensation.
Yeah. This film was made for the New York Central Railroad, and it was one of the most sensational films made in the early years. The train disappearing suddenly was quite a remarkable experience. This film is something of a mystery. It was shot around December of 1896 in New Haven, Connecticut. And the theater owner apparently wanted them to make this particular film. And it's the first comedy that the company made.
Comedy in quotes, perhaps. Yeah.
This is a little bit of actuality film.
And this is Dixon as well, as I recall?
Probably.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting use of the frame.
Yeah. But those comedies were diversions for audiences, but the audiences of the very early years were much more fascinated by watching people do things, real things. Now, this is a stage act. This is Professor Leonardus and his dogs. Very patient cat.
It's very suspenseful.
About the time that this was filmed, Professor Leonardus was at the Coster and Bales Music Hall, and they had a fire, and most of the dogs were rescued, but they had a time chasing them all down. And this is ice skating in Central Park.
It's remarkable depth of field. Was that
Yes.
part of the camera design to
Yes.
ensure?
Have very specific information about how what lenses they were using. Bitzer was asked about it.
Oh, that's very valuable information. We like to imagine a near future where we can turn two-dimensional images into three-dimensional research spaces. And if we know the specific lens that was deployed, that'll be a great boon to that kind of an endeavor.